Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 14, Prelude to New National Elections, 1976. By seeking more orthodox Islamic support, both internally and externally during the early months of 1976, and bolstering the long standing central pillar of his foreign policy, Sino Pakistan friendship, while pushing his nuclear weapons program, Zulfi felt more confident about holding elections in early 1977. He wanted to be sure, however, of winning at least the two-thirds majority required for changing the constitution to return Pakistan to a presidential system, rather than having to appear before the National Assembly every month or so to justify virtually every step he took. He had hired an academic expert on constitutional government, Professor Leslie Wolfe Phillips of the London School of Economics and Political Science. He was busy preparing the new presidential constitution that year in London, working for the Pakistan embassy there, devising his own secret codes and deceptive use of appendices to draft a document that no one would be able to read or understand until Prime Minister Bhutto himself was ready to spring it on his unsuspecting nation. Wolfe Phillips flew to Pindi that July to brief Bhutto on his top secret labors. Pir Pagado, Talpur, and Asghar Khan all continued to attack Bhutto vigorously as they could, and though Pakistan's press kept most of their attacks out of news headlines, Zulfi was informed by his spies of every barb, every harsh word, every lie and falsehood aimed at himself personally or at his party. A week after returning from China, Bhutto flew to Kabul for an official visit with President Daoud. At the banquet he gave in Daoud's honor, Zulfi rose to say, "I cannot follow the nightingales and surpass them," quoting one of Ghalib's poems, which he translated. "So many problems beset me that they become easy." Indeed, on this trip, Zulfi waxed more poetic than he had been in recent years of diplomatic dinners. "I have come here to see that the future generation, the flower of tomorrow, is not going to be drowned by dewdrops. I have come, and I believe that our discussions have been fruitful." He invited Daoud to visit Pakistan. "We will give him a great and spontaneous welcome, the welcome that the destinies of the two countries demand." No better way, Zulfi knew, to win votes all along the frontier than to re-establish cordial relations with Afghanistan. His political timing, as usual, was flawless, but his 5 early June days in Kabul proved frustrating. The Afghan side sought the release of National Awami Party leaders being tried by the special tribunal at Hyderabad before it would reciprocate by recognizing the Durand Line as the international border. Zulfi later recalled, "On my part, I insisted that both actions be taken simultaneously." The talks were inconclusive. With Wali Khan in prison and his son soon to be found guilty of conspiring to murder Sherpao, Bhutto could hardly have asked for much more help from Kabul in his forthcoming struggle to win votes in the NWFP and Balochistan. Like Bhutto, of course, Daoud was trying to help keep his regime alive by winning as much international support as possible, buying whatever time he could for consolidating his power against attacks from both wings. He managed to avoid a third coup in 1976 and flew in and out of Pindi that August for a 4-day state visit in an atmosphere of frankness and understanding that resolved nothing. Little more than a year and a half later, Daoud and most of his family would be brutally murdered within his own palace walls. 2 days after returning from Kabul, Bhutto addressed the closing session of the Minorities Conference held in Rawalpindi under the Ministry of Minority Affairs. "At the end of 1971, we were a broken nation," Bhutto began. We have traversed a long, rugged road. The doubting Thomases have disappeared. The Cassandras and other prophets of dooms are crestfallen because their dark forebodings have been belied. We have had reforms in each and every field. We in Pakistan have withstood on the onslaughts of little mindedness, prejudice, and bigotry by drawing up the strength of our traditional values. Zulfi declaimed with an eloquence unmatched by any of his rivals. My friends, I offer you my felicitations that, in spite of the machinations of those who sprout intolerant preachings, you have manfully resisted alien influences. Their propaganda, whether brazen or subtle, that you have excluded from taking a full share in the life of our society, has had no effect. His ability to identify himself wholeheartedly with any group he addressed may have been his most remarkable political characteristic, for here he was all but openly denouncing Muslim fundamentalists, the Maulanas, the Mullahs he had a few weeks earlier welcomed with devout orthodox ardor as he opened the International Sirat Congress. My friends, Pakistan has a special interest in ensuring that the most beneficent treatment is accorded to its minorities. The establishment of Pakistan itself had as its background the chauvinistic intolerance towards Muslim, then a minority community betrayed by a power hungry non Muslim majority in undivided India. But some interested elements who tried desperately to make capital out of every issue would very much like the minorities to rally under the banner of dissidence. Will try to rouse your emotions and endeavor to lure you into a course of action prejudicial to your interests. Let not these gentlemen dupe you with their sweet talk. Let them not dangle before you their apparently tempting offers of political support and seductive images. Their interest lies in creating divisive conditions in the country. Anyone attempting to disrupt the oneness of the majority community in Pakistan through such a maneuver will be dealt with very severely and invoke the penalty fit for an enemy of the nation. Here spoke Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, not his kinder, gentler, youthful persona. Bhutto must have heard the harsh change in his tone and language, so he reverted to sweetness and light. My government happens to be attuned to modern humanism. Pakistan belongs to every one of us, irrespective of caste, color, or religious creed. He added, echoing Jinnah's first speech to the Constituent Assembly in Karachi on 11th August 1947, quoting that famous passage, "You may belong to any religion or caste or creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state. We are starting with this fundamental principle that we are all citizens and equal citizens of one state." Then he rightly noted that previous governments had expurgated that entire passage from official publications of Jinnah's speeches. They claimed to be the political heirs of the Qaid-e-Azam. They pretended to speak on behalf of a party, the Muslim League, which they associated with his name. Yet, such was their loyalty to the founder of the state, such their allegiance to his message, that they dared to censor his words and had no hesitation in garbling a speech of his which is one of the texts of our nationhood. I am grateful to the Providence that, in this vital respect, as in many others, it fell to the lot of the Pakistan People's Party government to salvage the Qaid's message from the debris piled upon it by the narrow mindedness and prejudices of a class of people whose leadership has now been finally discredited by the nation. As I speak to you today, I feel that I am articulating the Qaid's vision, and I am obliterating from my mind as well as yours the intolerance, the hypocrisy, the chauvinism, the bigotry, the morbid insecurity which, thanks to certain elements, still trying to stir themselves, held sway in Pakistan contrary to Qaid's hopes and aspirations. With Wali Khan behind bars, the opposition rallied round a revived Muslim League banner, led for the moment by the Pir of Pigaro. With Khar, Rame, and Asghar Khan all waiting in the wings, potentially more popular, if not more powerful leaders, as Zulfi knew from his numerous intelligence reports. By identifying his Pakistan People's Party and himself most closely with Quaid-e-Azam Jinnah and his dreams of Pakistan, Zulfi Bhutto raced as usual, well ahead of his political opposition. In July, Zulfi invited Jinnah's only daughter, Dina Wadia, to Pakistan for the centenary celebrations being planned for December, sending her several souvenirs of her great father for her two children, both of whom chose, as did their mother, to reside outside Pakistan. I am indeed very touched by your gracious invitation. Mrs. Wadia wrote Bhutto saying she would have been very happy to accept, but she had another distant commitment at that time. Social recluse that she was, Mrs. Wadia, long divorced from her Parsi husband Neville, who lived in Switzerland, never returned to Pakistan after having attended her father's funeral in Karachi. As elections draw near, it is time that we start making preparations. Prime Minister Bhutto wrote to all the chief ministers on 9th September 1976 with a copy of Ran Raza, his prime minister, for production. To start with, you should give immediate thought to the setting up of a provincial election hierarchy with a clear line of command. At the federal level, there will be a Supreme Federal Secretariat for controlling and coordinating the country-wide election work. This body will take final decisions on all vital matters. You should chalk out mass contact programs, prepare party propaganda literature, button slogans, gadgets. You should have lists prepared of outstanding speakers and poets. Polling officers and polling agents should be selected. Lists of party workers should be prepared. Efforts should be made to mobilize the potent and latent forces for the election campaign and special attention paid to women, students, labor, ex-servicemen, ex-prisoners of wars. Please pay special attention to the youth. The entire machinery needed for the election campaign has now to be put into first gear. This is not the first time I am writing to you on this subject, nor is it going to be the last. I have promised fair elections to the people. We must prepare for them like a battle. Zulfi had not as yet publicly announced when the elections would be called, but wanted to be sure that his own side's battle plans were well and carefully drawn before alerting the enemy to a date. He had all of 1977 to choose from constitutionally and hoped to pick the most auspicious, prospectively promising day. In any event, he was certainly in no rush to notify his opponents of his choice more than the 2 months before he was required by law to do so. As part of his party's pre-election propaganda battle plan, thousands of little red-covered books called Bhutto Says, a pocket book of thoughtful quotations from selected speeches and writings of Chairman Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, modelled on the little red books of Chairman Mao's wisdom, were distributed widely in Karachi, Lahore and Rawalpindi. Chief Minister Jatoi of Sindh himself penned the message in front of the book's introduction, noting that his great achievements have brought new life to the half-dead nation. Each small page carried its alphabetical quotation from the chairman's works, starting with aggression and running through youth. Some letters were more amply represented than others. The 15 P quotations opened with Pakistan, Pakistan People's Party and party members, and ended with propaganda and prosperity. By year's end, the Bhutto books had been translated into Urdu, Sindhi, and Pashto versions, published by the Motherland Press Bureau. Zulfi realized that no amount of propaganda alone, indeed, not even nominally enrolling more than half of the electorate in the bulging serried ranks of his party, would ensure a two-thirds majority if the economy remained as bad as it was because of stagflation, smuggling, inefficiency, incompetence, and natural disasters. Something more dramatic, he thought, would have to be done economically. By mid July, therefore, Zulfi decided to spring his latest nationalization scheme to his people over television and radio. I have to communicate to you tonight a decision meant to transform the hub of our national economy. It flows from that commitment which is supreme and everlasting in my heart and mind. That is the welfare, the happiness, and progress of the people of Pakistan. Our national economy, as you know, is primarily agrarian. One of the first campaigns which your government therefore launched was that of land reforms. We exempted small landowners from the payment of land revenue. We assured the farmer of minimum support prices for wheat. We established corporations for the export of rice and cotton in an effort to secure remunerative prices for these commodities in a volatile international economy. We arranged the supply of tractors. We reduced the price of fertilizers. We are doing our utmost to improve the quality of seed. But after all this sweat and expense, we found that the end product of agriculture was still beyond social control. Why? Who manipulates the agricultural market? Who steals from the urban consumer the advantage of substantial government subsidies? The middleman, be he a cottager or a paddy husker. For generations, the middleman in agriculture has sucked the farmer's blood and kept the consumer at his mercy. He hoards stocks, he underweighs the commodity, mixes one variety with another, forms a league with the smuggler, and establishes a black market. What a scoundrel, that middleman! And how fortunate for all poor Pakistani peasants and workers that their Prime Minister and party chairman had just discovered what the middleman's treachery was doing to the entire economy. First, it was the British, then Pakistan's only field marshal, then the industrialists and the capitalists and the civil servants and large landlords who had sucked the blood of the poor people Zulfi worked day and night to serve. Now it was the fault of the middleman. Pakistani middlemen, Zulfi argued, were worse than the British colonial exploiters of Lancashire and Manchester had been. Unobtrusively, with stealth and craft, they had successfully managed to convert a service, ginning or husking, into a potent instrument of economic hegemony. Perhaps quite true, yet how strange that he, who carefully studied and checked his Larkana crop accounts every season, had never noticed such stealth and graft before election eve. The case of wheat was slightly different from cotton and rice because wheat was subsidized by both federal and provincial governments, the former alone at the rate of more than $100 million annually. Not only to assure a price for the consumer within his means, but also to provide him wholesome, staple food. I cannot contemplate with equanimity the spectacle of our men and women falling prey to undernourishment and disease because of flour milling outside our control. For all the reasons Zulfi had enumerated, virtually every privately owned cotton ginning, paddy husking, flour milling unit or plant in the nation would, from today, come directly under the government ownership, control, and management. The new laws had already been passed by administrative feet. Flour milling, rice milling, and cotton ginning control and development ordinances, all officially signed. The new bureaucrats had been given their marching orders before their leader went on the air, for nothing could be left to chance. More than 2,000 units owned by tens of thousands of Pakistanis and worth approximately $1 billion were being seized as he spoke. Compensation was promised in accordance with our established policy in cash for the smaller undertakings and in bonds for the rest, to be paid as soon as possible. The explanation offered by Bhutto for the move was disingenuous. Let no one try to misinterpret this decision as the nationalization of an industry. We promised that we would not nationalize any more industries. Governments discard assurances given today by devoting themselves to what they consider a worthier objective tomorrow. Aggrandizement may be evil, but aggrandizement by the poor, the underprivileged, and the disadvantaged is pure justice, in accordance with the God's decree and the lofty ideals of man. However, an adherence to pledges and fidelity to our assurances are woven into our creed. The decision taken today breaks no promise. The units which have come today under the state control do not belong to the industrial sector. They are an integral part of our agricultural economy. Zulfi had always been good at winning points in the USC debates. Yet, even he seemed to grow a bit anxious as he delivered this economic thunderbolt to a startled nation, realizing that it might have a freezing effect upon all future investment. This should leave no room for the insecurity of those with timid hearts and sagging souls who have capital to invest in Pakistan, but are plagued by the morbid fear that it might be expropriated. I ask them, what is a better haven for your capital than your own country? A new stamp with Zulfi's smiling face appeared at this time. Its printed message, economic well-being of the people is the real strength of the country. Hanif Rame, one of the leading news spokesmen for the Pakistan Muslim League, openly attacked Bhutto's irrational economic policies and lack of fiscal responsibility as the prime cause of Pakistan's current bankruptcy. Rame's outspokenness led to his summary trial and conviction by a special tribunal for alleged misuse of official position and public funds. His sentence was 4.5 years in prison and a fine of 50,000 rupees. Prime Minister Bhutto never forgot that the army posed the greatest threat to his continued rule. Indeed, the most important reason that he allocated as much money as he did to build his personal federal security force was to be sure that he never needed to call out the army to control internal civil strife. Such a move usually led to longer-range military rule, for Pindy's GHQ always considered itself far more efficient and competent to run Pakistan than any politician or party. To help ensure the military's loyalty to him and his party on the eve of calling elections, Zulfi informed General Zia of his decision to allow junior officers in the army to purchase valuable lots of lands in DG Khan and Muzaffargarh districts of Punjab at virtually gift prices. Since the JCOs are financially not well off and their continued service to the country should not go unrecognized, Zulfi wrote to Zia, "You will appreciate that this substantial concession has been granted out of our keen desire to promote the welfare of the junior ranks of the army. I trust that you will let it be known to all ranks of Pakistan Army." Kissinger returned to Pakistan in early August to caution Bhutto against nuclear weapons proliferation. Zulfi refused to back down, however, and Kissinger diplomatically promised another few 100,000 tons of US wheat for flood-ravaged Punjab, after which Bhutto told the press he was satisfied with his meetings with the Secretary of State. Zulfi would later insist that Kissinger threatened to make a horrible example out of you if he did not stop trying to amass a nuclear arsenal for Pakistan. But that November, after the Jimmy Carter victory, Bhutto wrote to his old friend, "The termination of your present high office saddens me. I shall always cherish my association with you as a friend with esteem and affection." 7 months later, a shaken Prime Minister Bhutto told the Canadian ambassador to Pakistan that in their August 1976 meeting, Kissinger had been all brimstone and fire, warning that if Pakistan went ahead with plutonium reprocessing, the Prime Minister would have to pay a very heavy price. In September of 1976, Zulfi expected to win his forthcoming elections with a comfortable two-thirds majority and to host the first Third World Summit, which would give him valid claim to the sobriquet of his devotees already used in addressing him not only as Qaid-e-Awam but also as leader of the Third World. Pakistan was not invited to the fifth non-aligned summit held in Colombo that August, but Bhutto wrote to Prime Minister S. Bandaranaike to convey our warm and sincere felicitations on the eve of that meeting. It is the small and medium states which are most vulnerable to foreign aggression, interference, and domination. He wrote his small neighbor to the south of India, adding that the call for a new international economic order is not simply a slogan for the developing countries. It is an imperative need for survival. On his way home from Colombo, Colonel Gaddafi stopped off in Karachi for a brief secret summit with his dear brother, Zulfi Bhutto. Libya's aid to Pakistan at this time was substantial. A week later, Bhutto wrote Mrs. Bandaranaike again to congratulate her on the successful conclusion of the Colombo meeting, stressing your timely emphasis on collective action by all the developing countries. For the Third World, the essence of the present struggle lies in the confrontation between the rich and the poor, the so-called North-South polarization. I believe that it is now imperative for the developing countries to give a definite expression to their collective personality. At the highest level of the leaders of all the underprivileged nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, I hope you will endorse the call for a summit conference of all the developing countries. We shall remain in close touch with you to promote this conference. Margaret Thatcher, then still leader of the Tory opposition to Prime Minister James Callaghan, visited Zulfi Bhutto in early September and told the press in Pindi that his call for a Third World Summit was a very significant initiative. Libya's Gaddafi also announced his support for Bhutto's proposal, which was formally transmitted to Secretary General Kurt Waldheim by Pakistan's UN ambassador, Iqbal Akhund. Pakistan's Foreign Minister of State, Aziz Ahmad, presented the summit proposal to the Group of 77 at their Conference on Economic Cooperation among Developing Countries in Mexico City that September. In transmitting the proposal, Aziz Ahmad explained that a ministerial meeting was not enough. What is needed, as Prime Minister Bhutto has suggested, is the political will to exert our combined strength for changing a system that patently discriminates against the developing countries. But the Group of 77, like the UN, refused to be rushed into accepting Bhutto's proposed summit. It would not be held in Zulfi's lifetime. On 9 September 1976, when news of Mao's death reached him, Zulfi knew he had lost his strongest supporter in the Third World. Men like Mao Zedong come once in a century, Bhutto emoted, perhaps once in a millennium. They capture the stage and write the pages of history with divine inspiration. Chairman Mao was a giant among giants, the son of revolution, its very essence, indeed, its rhythm and romance, the supreme architect of a brilliant new order shaking the world. It was a eulogy the likes of which he hoped would be written about him. He remains immortal. His thoughts will continue to guide the destinies of people and nations until the sun sets forever. With Mao gone, Zulfi focused greater attention on Saudi Arabia, inviting King Khalid to visit Pakistan that October, quoting him as he had quoted Gaddafi. Cheering Pakistanis lined the entire route from Pindi's airport to Islamabad, which was draped with Saudi and Pakistani flags and pictures of the king and Qaid-e-Awam Bhutto. No fewer than 20,000 students in bright green and white costumes spelled out warm welcoming greetings to the Saudi monarch inside the new National Sports Stadium in Islamabad. The king and his equally regal host were entertained by Pakistan's best military band, playing both nations' anthems and by agile gymnasts on flying trapezes. All of Islamabad was decorated with bunting and pictures of the king with flowers and flags. The day after he arrived, King Khalid touched a silver trowel to the marble foundation stone of the King Faisal Mosque soon to be erected at the foot of Magala Hills in Islamabad. In Lahore, he and his host strolled through the beautiful Shalimar Gardens hand in hand. From Lahore, they flew to Karachi and Zulfi hoped Khalid would feel up to visiting Larkana. The king, however, was a bit weary by then, and October was hardly the month for hunting in Sindh. Nonetheless, it was a successful state visit, and Khalid promised an additional $30 million on the eve of his departure from Karachi, presenting a personal gift of a Rolls Royce to his host, which Bhutto accepted as a gift to Pakistan. Ingratitude is a sickness, Bhutto told his nation on the centenary of Quaid-e-Azam Jinnah's self-selected Christmas birthday. A nation that grudges honor to its leaders is a nation that thinks little of itself. The Pakistan People's Party derives its inspiration from Qaid's ideals and will never allow them to be submerged. The Qaid believed in democracy. We brought it back. The Qaid urged us to cultivate faith, unity, and discipline. We act on faith, we combat disunity, and we do not countenance indiscipline. The Qaid despised chauvinism. He condemned obscurantism. He warned us against the dangers of provincial prejudice and schisms. This describes exactly our outlook as well. By now, Rao-e-Rashid Khan, Bhutto's special secretary, whose intelligence duties focused primarily on preparing for elections, agreed with Reuters correspondent Graham Stewart's assessment that the opposition was in a sorry state of disarray and Bhutto should have no trouble winning the election whenever he decided to hold it. The Pir of Pegaro was known to be reluctant to discuss election strategy with Asghar Khan, who was, moreover, repeatedly frustrated by the unreliable attitudes of Professor Ghafoor Khan, soon to become Secretary General of the reunited opposition, and Maulana Mufti Mahmood, former Chief Minister of the NWFP and head of Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e Islami, who would soon become president of the combined opposition. The reported helplessness of the opposition leaders, even so much as to attend a meeting on time, encouraged Zulfi to believe that the moment had finally come to call the new elections. He would soon be 49, and he chose his birthday to announce a new gift package of economic reforms. My fellow citizens, Prime Minister Bhutto addressed the nation on 5th January 1977. You elected a government which has given you a pledge to stimulate social change that would transform our society. It was and is our conviction that unless our national wealth is more evenly distributed, we cannot achieve the social justice which is vital issue of the ideology of Pakistan. I do not consider myself a scientist and my nation a laboratory in which I should perform experiments. I do not fancy disruption, he insisted, as if suddenly joined in argument with some other self. I wish to enhance the nation's capability to produce wealth and to provide employment. Whether it can be done by private or by state enterprise is a matter of realistic assessment, not of any preconceived prejudice. I am for the people, but the assessment of the people's interest is not an easy matter. Your elected administration has to pass through strenuous exercise of balancing different considerations, trying to estimate how an important decision will look from Peshawar to Quetta or Lahore or Karachi or Dadu. If our agriculture is unsound, our economy cannot prosper. The new reforms included further limiting land ownership to no more than 100 irrigated or 200 unirrigated acres, with specified compensation for all land resumed by government. That land was to be granted to then cultivating peasants, other landless tenants, or those owning fewer than 12 acres, and failure to surrender land could be punished with rigorous imprisonment of up to 7 years or forfeiture of all property or both. An ordinance spelling out the changes was to be laid before Parliament in 2 days, just before that body was to be dissolved for election. If I were a politician like others, Bhutto declared on the virtual eve of his decision to announce elections, I would make this reform an attractive item in the manifesto of our party. But I do not act that way. Others may have renowned professionals in dangling promises, raising bogus slogans, faking a concern for the poor only in order to achieve their selfish political ambitions. The timing of the announcement of the reforms, he explained, was simply to help make our land green and more productive. And there were more exciting reforms as well, none of which had anything to do with electioneering, for that was the furthest from his mind. From today, we are abolishing land revenue and making agricultural income liable basically to the same taxation to which non agricultural income is subject. At the same time, we are protecting the small farmer, totally exempting all income from 25 acres or less of irrigated and 50 acres or less of unirrigated land from any income tax. There were many other gifts. This measure is a final proof that we have no favorites. We see no reason why a rich zamindar should not contribute to public exchequer in the same way as a rich trader or an industrialist. We believe in the integration of our society. This is not a matter of sentiment for us. We consider it a compelling imperative. The measures I have communicated to you tonight are designed to change the ethos of our country. To mollify the very wealth, he also cut the maximum taxable rate for the highest slab of income from 60% to 30% and promised to continue company rebates to stimulate corporate investment. He further promised subsidies for tube wells, fertilizers, tractors, and pesticides. It was his most munificent and the final birthday gifting to his people, to his nation, for this was the last birthday on which Zulfi Bhutto would be free to address anyone outside a courtroom or prison cell. My fellow citizens, I bow my head in gratitude to Allah for enabling me to fulfill my pledge to you to do away as quickly as possible with the vestiges of a feudal order in our society. Prime Minister Bhutto finished his message that night, almost intuiting, it seemed, that he would never speak to so large an audience again. These 5 years have been years of the oil crisis, inflation, and recession abroad, and of floods and drought at home. Is it not a case for legitimate pride that we did not let these calamities arrest the nation's forward thrust? Today's reforms are socially just and historically inevitable. They are the culmination of an irreversible process we initiated 5 years ago. With this culmination, my heart is filled with peace and with the satisfaction that, whatever the future may hold, I have not played false by my people. Had he any idea then what dread fate the future held in store for him?